Welcome to the Carter Center's Forum on Human Rights. My name is Josh Griffin, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. If you'd like to ask a question to today's guest, you can do so by joining the forum and completing the fields on this page to apply for membership. Today's conversation will showcase the role of poetry in demanding change against oppressive political systems that work to keep minoritized people in an enslaved state. You will hear how place influences poets' written testaments of their lived experiences and how they understand the world. Our guests will inform you on how introspection and self-awareness assists them in advocating for social change. We hope this conversation encourages you to recognize how you can get involved in the fight for social justice. And once again, we strongly encourage you to ask questions to our guests today. Please pop them into the live chat, and we'll be sure to incorporate them in today's dialogue. So joining us today, we have Smoked Poets and Dr. Arthur Zia. Smoked Poets is a Kashmiri street poet and organizer from East London. Her main body of work relies upon collective participation with musicians, rappers, animators, visual and video artists. She uses grassroots projects and platforms to amplify working class and immigrant cultural arts. Her poetry has been on exhibit at the Tate Modern in London and San Francisco's South Asian Cultural Festival, focusing on diaspora arts. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thank you for having us.
Of course. And additionally, we have Dr. Zia, who is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. She is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado. Dr. Zia is the author of Resisting Disappearance, Military Occupation of Women's Activism in Kashmir, which has won numerous awards. She's the founder editor of Kashmir Lit and is the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working on the Kashmir region. Thank you for being here. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started by watching Smokes Poets video, Where We From, and then come back and discuss. Where are you from, I should say.
Focus. If you only had befriended revolution of life, you wouldn't face such humiliation. He led you to believe a pessimist like power, a taste of fate, walls of hate, a chosen few, the rest escape. Exile, incarcerate, bring back the power. Slay your master, snort another line, smoke another spliff, drink another drink, feel another feeling, think another thought, dream another nightmare. We broke our backs for bread. Kashmir tears laced in red, worth every penny, but everyone's dead. Where you from again? I can't forget. Where you from again? Pay no taxes, uprise, boycott your masters. Better still kill your masters. I ain't the first one. Violence, we learn from violence. Violent, break your neck, cheat your dead pariah, not being fed. Snakes in bed, don't be late. Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. So many men, so many dead, so many friends, so many prisons. I can't forget the pandemic of the oppressed. Toxicity in the air filled her lungs. No, you can't say feelings are not words. So lost in touches, sometimes a touch too much. These bruises speak sometimes, fluorescent on my tongue. So many men, so many dead, so many friends, so many prisons I can't forget. A woman's world, so to speak, so much venom to spit. These ovaries not worthy of your grief. These courageous winds heavy on the hips. No, I don't feel love, I can't smell the scent. Not in a woman's death, but on a naked glass shattered when she left. God silent in his nest. You took our world and pieces of me never rest. So many men, so many dead, so many friends, so many prisons I can't forget. So many men, so many dead, so many friends, so many prisons I can't forget.
Man, Smoke, there's just so much going on in that video. Like the animation is crazy. I love how it's in black and white throughout, but at the very end, you know, you see the woman holding like a light and bringing the light out of the dark and into like a new day, almost like Plato's allegory of the cave in a sense. For me, a line that really stood out was Kashmir Tears laced in red. Can you explain to me in our audience, like, you know, how that phrase came about? Like, what does that kind of really mean to you?
Sure. Hi. I always find it difficult to explain my lyrics and the meaning of the lyrics, because often my friends who I've worked with throughout the years and myself have always said that, you know, art speaks for itself, and that actually the people who are listening, the people who it resonates to, can then sort of establish what it means to them and how that plays a part in their political thinking, or their struggle, or their resistance. And I think Kashmir Tears laced in red, I think is telling a story about a little bit about my experience, but also not just about me at all. In the background, the whole time, it's sort of looking at the history of Kashmir and what happened to those who, you know, resisted sort of the many rules that Kashmir was under. In this track, I'm talking a little bit about the Dogra rule and sort of the first Kashmiri worker movements when they, you know, refused to pay the higher taxes that were being asked of them when they were already, you know, being enslaved and working for such little money for such long hours. So I think that's where it comes from. The sort of agony of being oppressed but not being heard. So even though, you know, it's the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, that you can cry, you can divulge, but they will still kill you because those tears don't mean anything to them when they don't see you, when they don't humanize you. Actually, they demonize you, they
Mm.
dehumanize you. Um, and so when I wrote that line, that's what I was really thinking about, is that relationship that we have with the colonial elements in our lives throughout history. You know, yeah. and it,
Dang.
and it's, you know, it's really hard to. I'm yeah, I understand why that came out, that resonated to you, but
Yeah.
again, each line is a metaphor for also sort of the sort of struggle that Kashmir has, you know, the historical struggle and the present struggle of how much it's in line to sort of what's happening to other parts in the world, and sort of what Marxism taught me, what socialism taught me, has happened there historically. So yeah, that as well.
Dang, that's really cool just to hear the insight, you know, it's the thought process that goes into, you know, like a few words. There's just so much. I hear history, right? I hear dysphoria within that as you explain that. Dr. Zia, what kind of came to mind to you as you watched that video and hear Smoke explain that lyric?
The entire poem for me as a Kashmiri really
Think we might be having a little bit of technical issues, which is okay. Are you back?
Yeah,
yeah
I think you're back. All right. You stopped. We heard you kind of cut out as a Kashmiri woman. Then you faded out.
No, I've been on Zoom and other platforms for the last 2-3 days because we had snow days.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, and I don't know, it's only with this StreamYard that I'm able to make myself heard.
Okay.
So just going back to the poem, I'm should say I'm just deeply moved by
Mm.
the kind of work that Smoke does. And me calling you just Smoke, but the second generation Kashmiri, if I might say, I'm just so hopeful when I see her do the work that she does and reach out and make linkages. And
Yeah.
the words that she speaks and the words that she writes, and you talk line that reiterates and that kind of like comes back in even my own poem
Yeah.
just comes through, because I think when in California, see a soaking in this color, because that's the color the Kashmiris are doing the dyeing every day,
Yes.
and I think that gets to you viscerally. I mean,
Yes.
we do feel when wars and conflicts take people suffering, and you don't just suffering ordinary sufferings in an occupation, you actually see them dying, you
Mm.
actually see them being killed, and
Absolutely.
it just gets to you. If you just do a simple Google search, Kashmir conflict encounters, you will see the roads and the streets awash with
Mm.
pictures where there is the reflection of these people on the street, reflecting in the blood that's on the street. Well, or people who are just quote unquote the civilians or the non-combatants. Because I think stay with you viscerally, and I think talked about every now and then whenever something big happens in Kashmir. Right after that, there is a deluge of writing,
Okay.
especially in poetry, and you kind of see the same watching something wherever we are on the globe, and it just seeps just and kind of rehashed. Um, but I think it's very potent just to kind of talk about the recurrence of blood and red.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. And thank you. You're kind of cutting in and out, but honestly, you had me hanging on every single word. And then like just the whole, the reflection of Kashmir Tears, Jason Red, and like literal blood in the street, and how that's this visceral reaction. Like I saw that as you explained that. So like, thank you for that insight. A question for both of you: can you speak to the pandemic of the oppressed, stuttering, specifically within the context of Kashmir in East London? Like, what does that look like currently with this pandemic going on in East London and Kashmir? Smoke, it's all you.
Okay.
You go
Well,
first.
when I say those lines, pandemic or the oppressed, it's two things. It's also sort of a metaphor for the fact that we've always lived in a pandemic, which is capitalism, imperialism, colonization, and that the pandemic that we were the science of the pandemic that we were seeing all around the world was the sort of catalyst of capitalism. But also, it was, when I say pandemic of the oppressed, it's also the fact that it's always the oppressed that are the people that, even though this is a virus that's going around, it doesn't discriminate against class or race or gender or religion. And even so, that's the case, it's still being weaponized by the colonizers, and it's still the oppressed, the working class, who are suffering.
What is that
So,
suffering? What is that? If I can jump in, what does that suffering look like in East London? Because I'm
oh, it
not
was
there.
it, it it was bad here. It was, for the fifth richest city in the world, we saw absolute levels of death, and a lot of migrant workers were being killed. A lot of key workers were being killed, who were in the front lines. Boris Johnson is liable for the killing of over 100,000 people in Britain. So it looked, and the lockdown wasn't the worst part. That was just the reaction of the pandemic. But Arthur will be able to talk a little bit more instinctively about it. But in Kashmir, it was terrible. I mean, they weren't in Kashmir. The Indian state wasn't allowing Kashmiris to have vaccinations or to be vaccinated. I mean, every single day I saw Kashmiris putting up, people like getting ventilators, getting bits of equipment to help their neighbors, to help the hospitals in Kashmir. You can see the absolute chaos even online. You could see the situation in Kashmir was very, very bad. And again, Kashmir has been, throughout its existence under Indian occupation, it's been under so many curfews and lockdowns. And so for Kashmir, it wasn't a new thing that this was happening, but it was worse because they weren't getting any medical help under the occupation, which made it really difficult. And it's worse than that. The settler colonialism that was being introduced in Kashmir, where they were allowing huge pilgrimage to take place, where you had lots of Hindu nationalists going in there and spreading corona. So it didn't look great in Kashmir or London.
Got you. Thank you for that insight. We have a question for you, Smoke, from the audience. They want to know what inspired you to start making poetry and music about the conflicts in Kashmir.
Well, I think that I think I would like to, in the periphery of it all, I'm a socialist. So it's socialism that really got me to sort of look at Kashmir and the sort of and poetry and writing music. I don't know if it's a hard one because I find that I find that the fight that we Kashmiris are fighting sort of teaches you the sort of limitations of what identity really is. And being stateless or being displaced sort of teaches you the sort of things that we should put our efforts in. And I think Kashmir is, like what inspired me. I suppose that throughout the history of Kashmir and sort of the occupations and the empires that took over it, from the Mughal Empire to the Afghan Empire, we've always had a tradition of Kashmiri poets writing and documenting the history and our culture. And I think when I looked into that further and realized that this was an historical thing, something that Kashmiri socialists and nationalists did from day one, and that is how people like myself, who have a very colonized, who were born in sort of such a colonized perspective, it was important to look into that. And I think that's mainly what inspired me. But also, I know that to be able to unite with the people back home who I'm not allowed, I'm from Azad Kashmir. I've never been allowed to go to the India occupied Kashmir because of the crossing line between the two. So what I realized was, in order to reach the people that I really wanted to reach, the people that I was fighting for. The only way that I could really sort of reach out and communicate and sort of was by writing poetry and music, and be, you know, that being periphery in many ways of fighting for what's happening there in the diaspora, in a country which is massively a part of the occupation of Kashmir, Britain. So I guess being in that position gave me the agency to be able to be inspired, but also to write and inform others of what was happening.
No, that's
Sorry,
awesome. That's powerful. No, that's powerful, because I mean, we all possess our own agency and the ability to, you know, write our truth and speak our truth. And it's beautiful to hear how you go about doing that, with your activism and your writing, and really, you know, leave your history, right, your story, for the world to know, you know, your lived experiences, and what you're fighting for. Dr. Z, I want to follow up with you and kind of hear about, you know, your thoughts on the pandemic of the oppressed. And I also want to mention, Dr. Z had turned off her camera, so that, inshallah, the internet is more stable.
Sorry, I don't know why the internet is so choppy.
It's all good.
So,
Don't worry.
are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, I think this is that when we are thinking about East London and we're thinking about the pandemic of prevalent upon so many societies and cultures all across the world, we have to understand it in that pandemic in Kashmir is the military occupation. It's been going on for the last 72 Indian occupation, and before that, historical oppression and occupations that Kashmiris have undergone. So I just want to take the audience back to 2019, August, when India unilaterally and militarily autonomy within the Indian constitution. Again, we can debate what that autonomy looks like and how Kashmiri is connected to it. That's a separate question. But the fact remains that the siege from August 5th onward, by the time March 2020, the pandemic, quote unquote, lockdown started, Kashmiris did not know where the siege ended and the pandemic lockdown started. At the time, as Shama also, Hindu nationalists really are pushing this pilgrimage to terrorism by other means. They did a sports event which brought into Kashmir. There was no COVID testing, and this was March 2020 when the pandemic was on the rise. So what we saw going forward from that point onwards was how India really took over this pandemic and used lockdown on Kashmiris. Many Kashmiris who I spoke to, and I've written about the necropolitical power of Indian state and how they really hold on the reins to. Frequently, what exactly happened was that crack down on Kashmiris, and Kashmiris would say that, you know, the pandemic, the COVID might be merciful, but the occupation and the military occupation is going to really be death and grave. And that's what we saw happening in houses in fake. And the other thing that's really simple did, and it kind of tells you how it weaponized and how not just the way of cracking down the militants and the combatants or even civilians were killed, their bodies were not returned to their families. Funeral solidarity really comes together, because there's no other place to show solidarity. With the ambushes and with the Indian Army. So during this COVID, what we saw was these bodies being no one except for a few family members to be allowed to have the pandemic SOPs were being deployed to doubly oppress Kashmiris, and any form of expression that, just social life, day-to-day, everyday funerals and births, and
Dang.
was really utilized as a weapon by India, and continues to do so.
Thank you for that insight. You're chopping up there, so we're to kind of get bits and pieces of what you were talking about, and very insightful, and just good to know about, because I know out here in the States, you got to seek that out. We don't really report on those issues, so it's good to know that these ills and human rights abuses are taking place. And I think now we're all duty bound to play our part, to advocate for change within Kashmir and anybody who faces any type of oppression. One thing that I did hear you talk about during your little spiel there is the Versus Journal of the Kashmir Siege. And I wanted to play 3 minutes of this poem that you wrote, and then have you be able to just provide an audience with the insight of what inspired it, and also the image, to know that's of importance to you. So we're going to go ahead and play the first 3 minutes of this piece that you wrote.
When I asked if there will be a war, they replied, "Did it ever end?" and continued their song. Impending Siege, 4th August, 2019. Our hearts are sinking, but our prayers are rising. Azadi, Azadi, Azadi. 4th day of the Kashmir Siege, 8th August, 2019. My sister assures me over and over, everything is fine here, over a glitch connection, and this tells the worst. 5th day of the Kashmir Siege, 9th August, 2019. Communication is cut, but our ties are strong. We hear war cries of a battle-ready people. 6th day of the Kashmir Siege, 10th August, 2019. The heart of Eid is sacrifice. In Kashmir, Eid is every day. 7th day of the Kashmir Siege, 11th August, 2019. Don't go out into the street, you will get shot. One can hope, the lover of freedom shot back. 8th day of the Kashmir Siege, 12th August, 2019. Eid passed peacefully through the checkpoints, razor wires, and children that know how to stay still. 9th day of the Kashmir Siege, 13th August, 2019. A passionate assembly seeking rights as a nation. Your TV screen brands a law and order situation. 10th day of the Kashmir Siege, 14th August, 2019. August in Kashmir is a siege on steroids. India wrapped in saffron, Pakistan awash in green. Kashmir always soaks in blood, red of its old and young, those being born and those not yet. 11th day of the Kashmir Siege, 15th August 2019. Mother, the world's largest democracy is afraid of your small voice. 12th day of the Kashmir siege, 16th August 2019. Mother, Google search brought Kashmir dispute ahead of Kashmiri shawls.
First of all, Dr. Zia, thank you for writing that piece. I feel like, that this piece just encapsulates everything that you were just speaking to in Kashmir with regard to COVID and the pandemic. And I think for our audience, I hope you can see how poetry enables you to be able to take real life events and, write it down for people. One line that really stood out to me was, the heart of Eid is sacrifice. In Kashmir, Eid is every day. What sacrifices occur in Kashmir every day, Dr. Zia?
So I just wanted to make sure that, am I audible?
You're
I
all
just
good.
joined by phone. I'm just trying to.
Oh yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Yeah,
I can hear you very less, but hopefully it should be okay for me to listen to the questions and answer them.
Yeah.
So, so the line that you are talking about, the heart of Eid is sacrifice, and in Kashmir, Eid is every day. The reason I kind of like, as for the audience, that Eid is the holy day that is celebrated after, one is after the Ramadan and one comes 2 months after, and that is when you sacrifice maybe a goat or a sheep just to show your gratitude and sacrificial kind of element in your spirituality and in your religiosity. So I think when the siege was going on, what I was trying to do was every day write a verse or highlight something that had happened. And I kind of maintained a journal of 160 days. That's how long it kind of went, but it went beyond that as well when there were partial curfews and stuff like that. So what happens in that verse is basically, when we look at such a situation of siege, when we look at a situation of despondency and occupation, it kind of seems that people are despondent and there is melancholia and people are hopeless. But I just wanted to highlight that Eid is celebration. Eid is not just an event that is done at the end of a holy day or, just to mark a religious event. But Eid is also about the spirit of happiness. It's about the spirit of gratitude. And in Kashmir, Eid is every day. Just goes on to kind of like show that there is so much sacrifice involved within Kashmir at this moment, even as we are speaking, not just people giving their lives and giving their bodies, but everyday events that can happen, continue happening in a manner that people have to even sacrifice a little bit, like, just taking your child out for a birthday. Not with just the COVID lockdown, but the deep siege, the military occupation that kind of limits everything, that limits the Kashmiri imagination, that limits Kashmiri mobility. So those sacrifices happen every day, and most of those sacrifices are not even marked anywhere. What we many times kind of know in the narrative that India tries to portray to the rest of the world, either Kashmir is normal, or they try to say that, people there are, as Shama earlier talked about, that you either demonize people or you dehumanize people, you never humanize them. So I think it's very important for me as a Kashmiri to say that even though these sacrifices happen, but there is also a celebration of life happening every day by the very act of living this every day, by the very act of making sure that everyone is getting milk, bread, their breakfast in the morning, and marking these holy days and marking funerals, marking weddings, just to get those two elements together, the sacrifice and the spirit of celebration. And I think we see that in people who are in active resistance, be that the First Nations, be that the Palestinians, be that anyone across the world who is occupied. We see those going side by side, and I think that's what basically that line is trying to say, that there is Eid every day. There might be all these sacrifices that are happening, which are not, people don't have to undergo those. I'm not trying to glamorize the sacrifice or glorify the sacrifice. I hope that it comes to an end and they live the life that they deserve. But at the same time, Kashmiris are very, very resilient, because that's what they have done for the last 500 years. So that's the two elements kind of bringing together, just the celebration and the sacrifice.
So yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing. Can you also tell our audience about the picture? Because I know that picture is of importance to you.
So the picture is, it was like, my father and my mother, they decided to go to this shrine for 6 days. So the shrine is really important for Kashmiris. It's a sign of Kashmiris' political and cultural and religious independence. Um, So there's a lot of history behind the shrine, but this is called the Shrine of Amir, or the leader or the commander, or you could also say a religious leader or a spiritual leader, whichever way you want to take it. And this particular saint, he's from the medieval times, but you still have a shrine dedicated to him that he set up as a school back in the medieval times, and his missionaries started that. It's on the river Jhelum. So my parents, most Kashmiris, they make sure that they go to this place, offer prayers. There's a mausoleum, as you see. There's also a standard from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on the side. So there's lots of relics there. So many Kashmiris go to there on ordained days for supplications and all sorts of different kinds of spiritual practices that they have. My parents had decided to go there, and they sent me this picture on WhatsApp on August 4th. And then my father sent me this, and then he also sent a picture of my mother along with it. And he said, we will be going here for 6 days now. And that was 4th August. And that was the last picture that I got from them. And from August 4th till late October, November, I had no connection with them. And I think that goes on for most of us. We didn't have any connection. And Genocide Alert issued Genocide Watch issued an alert for Kashmir during that time, because there was a heavy communication siege. There was no internet, there was no phone. And one of the verses talked about my sister calling on a glitch connection. And that was really true. That day, just a random phone call occurred from an unknown number. And that was my sister talking to me for less than 2 minutes and telling me everything is okay. I don't need to worry. So it was that kind of a tone where everything is going wrong. And you're telling someone outside just not to worry because you kind of want to protect them from the information. So the police stations during that time, what they had done was they had set up phones like within 1 or 2 months, so that Kashmiris outside could get some message from their families inside. And people used to be in these long lines, just like in a prison. Maybe it's sort of like the state of exception that was created, this concentration camp that Kashmir had become. So there was a long line of people who would be calling their friends and family outside Kashmir and just tell them the news that everyone is okay. So while my sister was conveying that they are doing okay, she had no news of her parents as well, because they lived away, they lived some distance away from her in the next town. So she actually didn't know what was happening. So she just got this opportunity to call me, and she did. And she just wanted to see if I was doing okay. But she at that time did not know, because they had no connection. So they were able to send some message outside, very brief, but they did not know what was happening to people, even in their neighborhoods, because there were so many concertina wires, there were barricades. So in Kashmir, when there are curfews, when there used to be curfews, like old-timey curfews, neighbors would at least talk to each other. But this time round, even those were barricaded. So people could not move from one place to another. And imagine taking those elements into pandemic, and kind of like how people were barricaded even during the pandemic. So that kind of goes. That picture is the last picture that I'd received on WhatsApp from my father, and that for me became so symbolic, because it was, on one hand, there was this element that these old retiree couple wanting to go, and then I asking them if there is what's happening around, and they said, we're used to this, because on August 4th, Kashmiris were trying to store gas in small flasks, because they knew something was happening, but they didn't know what was happening, because the government of India and the administration was giving them mixed messages. It was telling them everything is fine, nothing is going to happen. Some people were saying there's going to be a war between India and Pakistan. And so Kashmiris, what they do in these times is because that's what their life is. They mostly don't know what's going to happen. So they will, and they're also winter people. They're also mountain people. So there's always lots of supplies. There's rice, there's pulses. So they were trying to stock up for whatever it was that is going to happen. So I asked my parents, and they said, we are used to this. War is always around us. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we are doing this pilgrimage to this shrine from now on for 6 days. But that was the only one time that they could go there. And that's the picture from that day.
What an amazing story, and just to know, what people are experiencing. And that's what I'm grateful to be able to be here amongst you all, is to be in the know and to learn from you both, because I had no idea, no clue. Smoke, can you follow up and provide us with your thoughts?
I always feel very emotional when I listen to Athol, because she teaches me so much about things that I feel but I don't know, that I haven't experienced. So I'm always quite wary of what to say in these circumstances, because that's why I write poetry, because I deal with this sort of separation, but also the need to remove, poetry and politics and all these things are so personal. So I always sort of try to take everything in and learn from it, but also politically grow from the likes of Afrazia. And to be honest, that poem hit me. It hits in a way in which it's not painful. It's there's a relief in the fact that we understand what's going on, and we understand that these things are happening, and we're not alone in wanting to fight those things. Really, it's really hard to really articulate my thoughts when it comes to that, and that is the main reason why I do write poetry. But I've got a line saying, the distance won't let me be the indigenous. It begins everywhere and stops at me, because these histories started these issues and histories started such a long time ago, and it's almost playing catch up. But you're also, you're trying to document those things and what they mean now through poetry. That's I'm not a very spiritual person, you see. That got really taken out of me living in East London, and I know that Kashmiris go through their own level of Islamophobia, because that's how the Indian state justifies its oppression of Kashmiris, and the occupation is by labeling them terrorists. But after Iraq war, and the war in Afghanistan, and the sort of war on Muslims, so to speak, across the world, I think I turned to Marxism, I turned to socialism, rather than sort of religion, which I think my parents found very difficult. And that's another reason, the way I coped with that sort of transition in my life is by writing poetry, because I think poetry gives us clarity. A poetry is a political act, and I think by writing poetry, by sharing it with comrades and people that are oppressed, you're able to translate that and hopefully make a transformative difference in how we fight these things.
No, absolutely. One thing that stood out to me is your statement and your line of the distance won't let me be the indigenous. And additionally, in a previous conversation, you also mentioned that you're bilingual, and you have spoken all these languages that aren't yours. So can you both tell me how your identities and who you are just show up in your written work, in your scholarship, and this kind of how you live your life. How does your identity influence how you navigate poetry, how you experience the world?
Arthur?
Oh.
I mean, Arthur could actually speak, you know, Kushal. I can't. I was
Well,
never. Go on,
I
sorry.
think, okay, let me start.
Yeah.
I think I've thought about this a lot, like just being a Kashmiri who, I think the answer kind of goes back to this evolving notion of decolonial praxis. I really feel I feel like I'm so lucky to be living in a moment where there is so much evolving understanding around indigenous and decolonial knowledges, that I feel all of us kind of are thinking about these things. When we talk about art and resistance, and we talk about people like me or Shama or other of our colleagues and people in our generation and those coming in who are writing, it almost seems like to a lot of people that Kashmiris are only now writing. But I know that Shama alluded to the fact that Kashmiris have been writing for the longest possible time. And why does that connect to language? The question that you asked. Kashmiris have written for the longest possible time, but it's only the fact that it's not been written, a lot has not been written in English and not been published in the sense and taken to the rest of the world, which is why most of what they have written in the last 72 years was also easy for India to invisibilize. And in that, my own journey was being from a post-colonial region, which now I know is not a post-colonial region, but is an active neo-colonial situation where India is this ethno-nationalist, Hindu supremacist nation colonizing Kashmir. But, we had to learn English. Without English, you probably would not get anywhere in life. And I think that's the post-colonial malaise that's happening, and that has happened in more than half of the world. And in that, my own journey was that I used to write in Kashmiri. I used to write in Urdu. And I was actually, when I was during my teenage, I was slightly precocious in many of the things that, kids do. I also sub-edited an Urdu journal for this very well-known critic and Urdu and Kashmiri poet. So I was working on that project. So I was trying to write Urdu, and I was trying to write Kashmiri, and then I was also writing in English, because one of my earliest collections that was published long back in the late 90s. And then who won amongst all of these languages? And I think English kind of won in a way, because I slowly realized that if I stay in Kashmir and if I'm writing in vernacular languages, probably no one is going to listen to this. And I realized that so many people had written about Kashmir, but because they had stayed local, and that kind of pushed me from my comfort zone to really go out and start thinking about, different jobs, different professions, and we might talk about that later, but come to academia and talk about Kashmir, and not let go of my poetry and my creative side as well. But then English won in that moment. And it's only in the last 5 years that I'm kind of going back to Kashmiri writing, and mostly inspired by the likes of Gugi Wathiango, and who kind of goes back to his original language, his mother language, Guyuku, and writes in that, taking inspiration from decolonial scholars and that's how I show up as Kashmiri. There were these moments in my poems where I was, and that's really in the recent poems and also some of the earlier ones, where I was kind of like slipping into Kashmiri, but then melding it with English as well. And I didn't know what that was doing for me, and I wasn't even thinking about it. But then steadily I began to realize that there was this element where I kind of wanted to pull Kashmiri back into my own identity and wanted to manifest that in some form. And poetry was the first place where I kind of brought it back. But now I'm also with Kashmir Lit, where I'm kind of like starting these series of, we've already started that. There's a series of interviews that is happening with Kashmiri poets, and they talk about their poems, and we're trying to bring it on the global platform. So that's how I think I show up in my poems especially as a Kashmiri, with the languages that I have and that are involved in that thinking process. I often ask myself, like when I think my first thought, is it in Kashmiri, is it in Urdu, or is it in English? So those are the kind of battles that are going on. And I know that we are always, I'm an anthropologist, so I know that we're always blessed by knowing many languages, because languages are just a window to a different world. It's a different universe altogether, and it's a different language. So you get to know, the more languages you know, the more blessed you are to understand the world in so many different ways. But because we are an occupied people, I do think that there is so much demerit in being taken, this language being taken away. And it was actively taken away from us, not just by the post-colonial Malays, but also by the school system, which did not recognize this language. So maybe, when I was a teenager, when I was in college, you would have asked me the history of global history, US history, British history. I knew all of that, but I knew nothing of Kashmiri history because that wasn't taught to me, because the language was actively cut from the people. And that keeps happening. Even though it's in schools, we still pay obeisance more to Urdu. And again, that's kind of becoming less. To English, it's more, because English promises you a better profession. It promises you entry into a world where every kid is supposed to go, which is like great, great jobs, great employment, and that's where English leads you. So in that sense, we are kind of like forced away from our history, and it's very hard to organically go back to it. And now at this stage of my life, I feel like I can go back to Kashmiri because I have done the things that I require. But then it's also like proving yourself to the rest of the world and kind of bringing your message in their language, and then starting to think about where is Kashmiri and how do I foster that and how do I nurture it. So it's a very it's kind of like a circuitous route that one has to take. But I hope that was for us. But for future generations, it might be easier.
Dang. I'm just like I'm in class right now taking notes. Thank you, Professor. That was beautiful. I want to follow up with you, Smoke, and get your thoughts, but I really want to show this video. We got about 6 minutes, so we're going to play this video, come back, get final thoughts, and wrap everything up. So if we can play that, we'll be good.
Violins sweep with gypsies going to Andalusia. Violins sweep for Arabs leaving Andalusia. Violins weep for a time that does not return. Violins sweep for a homeland that might return. Violins set fire to the woods of that deep, deep darkness. Violins tear the horizon and smell my blood in the vein. Violins sweep with gypsies going to Andalusia. Violins sweep for Arabs leaving Andalusia. Violins are horses on a phantom string of moaning water. Violins are the ebb and flow of a field of wild lilacs. Violins are monsters touched by the nail of a woman now distant. Violins are an army building and filling a tomb made of marble and Naha wound. Violence are the anarchy of hearts driven mad by the wind in a dancer's foot. Violence are flocks of birds fleeing a torn banner. Violence are complaints of silk creased in the lover's night. Violins are the distant sound of wine falling on a previous desire. Violins follow me everywhere in vengeance. Violins seek me out to kill me wherever they find me. Violins weep for Arabs leaving Andalusia. Violins weep with gypsies going to Andalusia.
So we have 2 minutes left. I just want to point out real quickly the transition to the red and then go back to how we began this conversation. Kashmir Tears laced in red. If you all can provide our audience with, brief statements before we close everything up, that'd be great. The floor is yours.
Brief statements.
If that's possible, but we could go over, of course. I do have a hard cutoff, but at like 05, but we're good.
To answer the question, to tie in everything, is poetry and music still a political act for social change in 2022? Well, I think that it is the most pivotal act to relish in and to encourage, because it's an inspiration. It's what builds momentum. It's what understands and documents the truth that sometimes can't be told in any other way. Poetry is prescient in how it's versed, and how it entails and documents the acts of the mass individuals, but collectives of people. I learned so much from writing poetry and sharing poetry with comrades and beyond. I learned that it's so pivotal because it involves telling the truth, and it's such a responsibility that we take on in sharing the truth, and that's something that writers and political Marxists like June Jordan taught me. The Black resistance, the Black struggle, from Linton Kwesi Johnson to June Jordan, have always taught us, in order to fight the empire, in order to fight the oppressed, we have to stand up, and that's where the purpose of poetry, the real essence of it, comes forward. And I think where we find ourselves today, if we look at Great Britain, if we look at Kashmir, the realities are bad. They're staring towards fascism. And I think in order to fight the periphery of that is to have art and music, all forms or mediums of art and music and poetry in the center of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please go and follow Smoked Poets. She also has a radio show in East London every Tuesday, so tune into that. Dr. Zia, if you can give our audience some final thoughts and words, that'd be great. You're muted.
I just want to echo what Smoke has already said. I think, as people who are occupied, and you just heard Mahmoud Darwish's poem Violence, which was translated by Agha Shahid Ali, he's kind of like this de facto bard of Kashmiri people. He's a Kashmiri American poet. And his birthday is tomorrow, by the way. So what you kind of like see is this coalescing of two struggles, like Palestine and Kashmir, while they're not same, but they're very similar. And I just want to talk about Agha Shahid's work a little bit, how he has been able to tell a lot about Kashmir while just pursuing what seemingly is an art. But for Kashmiris and occupied people, I don't think art is a luxury. It is, as Smoke already said, it's a responsibility, and it's also a form of catharsis. And then it's also sad because a lot of Kashmiris cannot do art in the same manner that they would want to do. And I think that's very, very important for us to remember, like how you do art inside Kashmir and how you pursue arts outside Kashmir for Kashmir. So for me, I had to leave Kashmir to do this kind of work and pursue this work. And I know many, many people who are far more skilled and competent and far more creative than I am, but who are not able to pursue it in the same manner because they live in an occupied zone. But still, they pursue art. And I think for us, it's so important to have arts, to have poetry, to have fiction at our disposal so that we can tell the story in many different ways. So in that sense, as I just echo what Smoke has already said, that it is our responsibility. It's something that we have to. For me personally, as an academic, I came back to academia, even though primary work that I do is on Kashmir, but I never stopped doing poetry, never stopped pursuing creative arts, because I felt like these were my personal catharsis, but at the same time, I wanted to carry it into the words that I'm writing. I wanted to do art because it's political, and essentially it goes into spaces where no one else dares to go. And I think in that sense, art is so daring. It just is a clear mirror that people can see themselves in, and in that sense, I feel like it gives me so many tools every day that I would not have as an academic otherwise. Even though academia is considered to be a very protected place where you have freedoms, you have academic freedoms, but I still think that arts are the place where you really have this vast, compassionate space to express what you want to. But again, positionality is important. I'm outside Kashmir, so I'm able to do many of those things. But inside Kashmir right now, there's a lot of repression going on, and many people are not able to even put out what they would have in normal circumstances. And that's very sad.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I've learned a lot. I know our audience has learned a lot, and I feel we're all duty bound to continue to fight for people who live in oppressive societies, or just in general. So please look forward to engaging with you all in future conversations, and thank you all for your time. Good night, good afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you, Asad.
Same here.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Smoke, and thank you, Joshua. Bye.